Good morning everyone. In this video we are going to make a practice exercise for the ADT subject. So if you open up this repository, which you can find in the description, the link in the description, or you can copy it from here, you will have the full solution in the movies folder, and you will have the exercise in the readme file of the root of the repository. So basically, firstly, we should always read everything regarding what is the task and what is the exercise. So you can see here that our aim is to create a single layer console application based on the following tasks. So we immediately know that we do not have to create so many layers, like for example in the semester exercise, we have to create a single layer application. We will have to create a database in a code first approach. For that, we will use a movie entity with these given properties here. Then we have to use an XML document which we should process, and by the processing we will create these movie entities which we previously created here, and basically we will return some kind of collection based on these movies. Then we will have to create attribute usage. For that, we have to create our custom attributes or our custom classes regarding the attributes. Then these attributes will be applied to the movie entity on some properties. Then we will use reflection in order to validate our entities based on our attributes, and then we will create a unit testing section for the validation part of the exercise, and then finally we will create a few queries in LINQ which will return us back some collections of the movies selected, grouped by, and so on and so on. So basically this is our full task. You can find it here, and then I open it up in Visual Studio Code, and then we will create the exercise in Visual Studio. So I have to create a new project. I will create a console application. I will save it to the desktop, and I will name it as Movies Live. But you can name it however you want. And please make sure that even though .NET 6.0 is already released, we are still using .NET 5.0. And it is very important because when we are adding NuGet packages, we have to remember that we are using this target framework, this version of the target framework. And that is something we have to keep in mind. Otherwise, the NuGet package manager will warn us that the newest version is not compatible with this one. Okay, so far so good. This is the current state of ours. So the first thing we have to do is a single layer console application, which is completely fine because it's already created. The second thing we have to do is the database creation itself. So for that we have to come here to the property, to the project, right click, and we have to add a new item. This new item we can search here for serve, and we can find service-based database selected here, and we will name it movies as it requested. Yes, and name it movies with a capital M. It doesn't really matter in terms of technical perspectives, but we should use it however it's needed. Okay, then we can see that we have the .mdf and .ldf items here. For the MDF, right click and properties, and in the build action, I move it a bit here. In the build action, we have to select content, and we have to set it for copy always, and we do the LDF as well. So we have to come here, select the content, and we have to select copy always. Okay. So in that case, whenever we are building something, all the MDF and LDF will be copied to the bin debug folder, and that way we always have a fresh database. Good. The next thing will be to open up the Server Explorer, and under that you can see that we have the movies.mdf, and if we click on this just once, we immediately have this properties window opened here. But if you can't find it, you have to right click on it and open properties as well. And you can have here the connection string. This connection string is very important, so we have to double click inside this text box, Control C, sorry, and we copy out the full connection string, and this should return us something. This should return back something like this. Okay, then in the Server Explorer we will set here that close connection, and we can close the Server Explorer as well. Okay, so basically the main important thing here is we have to gain the connection string this way. Okay, in order to be a bit more flexible, what we have to do is to change this highlighted part to two pipe symbols, which is Alt Gear W in a Hungarian keyboard. And basically we have to write here data directory. And this data directory will enable us that if we run this full program in somebody else's machine, in your machine or on my machine or whatever, then of course it will dynamically have the directory. Otherwise, it is looking for the C drive users SM user, which probably is not on your computer. So basically, this data directory means us this. Okay, so so far so good, and let's see what is the next step. So we added a service-based database, named it correctly, and then we have to create a movies table using a code-first approach. This means that we have to create a class here, add class. So right-click on the project name, and you have to select add new class, and this opens opens this window up, and we have to name it movie. It says here that create the movies table, but that means that we have to use attributes to create the movies table themselves. But basically what is happening here is we are creating the entity class itself firstly, and entity classes usually have a single form, so movie or cat or dog, not movies or cats or dogs. So this is why we have movie here. We name it or we set the visibility to public, and by this section that create a movies table, we mean that we should add an attribute here with table, and this should have the name movies. Otherwise it would create I think by default it adds an S to make a plural form of the entity. But for example, if we would like to have it like my favorite movies, we can rename it anyhow we want, but we will simply use it movies. For that, we will use the control dot, and we are using this section here. And then what we have to do, so we created the movie class, and then we have to add the following properties. So we will have an ID, which will be an integer, and for that we immediately will use a key attribute, not foreign key but simple key. And for that we have to use this kind of using, which is the component model dot data annotations. Then we will have a public string title with a get set option. This will be the movie's title, of course. Then we will have a string genre as well, which will be the movie's genre. And then we will have a year of release, which is an integer, public int year of release, when the movie was released. Okay, so far so good. So basically we created this entity class. If we open up this XML a little bit later, we can see that there are additional properties in the XML, but it doesn't matter. It's not a problem for us because we can use less information from a bigger XML. So that is why it's an easier or a less complex exercise for us. Okay, so we created this movie entity here, and before we moving along for the XML processing, we simply can test out our full database, if it's working, if it's connecting correctly. So for that, we have to use the following, because we simply have the entity class here, but we don't have the context class, which is basically the database class in the background. So we have to add here a new class, and for that we will use movie context with a capital M and capital C. And in the movie context we will make it for public, and we have to do the following. First step is to inherit it from the DB context base class. For the DB context, we can see that using the control dot, we do not have any option to use something. So it immediately means and refers us that we have to use the install package from the NuGet package manager. We can do it from here, but I would advise to come here instead. So come here instead, and for the project, right click, add, and below add you can find manage NuGet packages. And for that, it opens this window up, and we can write here NTT framework core. Microsoft.entity framework core, and you can see here that there are many versions here. First we have to use, I think the latest stable version will be fine for us, but we will see. We accept it. Yes, and it's already installed. So we can check under dependencies and frameworks that there are additional things, I guess. So if we come back here and control that, it's still not good. Let me see. Entity framework core. Okay, I think it gives us an error, and that is what I wanted to turn out. Yes, sorry. So it writes here that entity framework core 603 is not compatible with .NET 5. So this is what I wanted to highlight you during the creation of the project, that it's very important that these versions should match together. And for the .NET 5.0 version, we have to use 5.0.15 version. Anything is compatible which starts with a 5 basically, but amongst the 5 we should use the latest version. So I will use 5.0 and 15. Okay, so far it seems to be okay. And then if we control dot here as well, loading suggestions, it lets us using Microsoft Entity Framework Core here as well. So then we can see that it will work just fine. Okay, so the next step will be that inside the movie context, I want to create something which can hold for me movie entities, and for that we have to use public virtual db set type for movie type. So it's a generic type which we use movies, and rename it as movies. And the next thing will be to create a constructor for the movie context. Basically only what we write here is that this database.ensure created method, and one last step is ahead of us when we add the connection string which we previously copied here. So for that we have to create a protected override void onConfiguring method, and this onConfiguring method should have a db context options builder ob for that name. And inside what I have to check is if the ob that is configured is not true, then I have to use the following: ob that use SQL use lazy loading proxies and use SQL servers. So this is when I have to use use SQL server and enable lazy loading. So for me, the SQL server is not yet installed and the lazy loading is not yet installed as well. So for that, I have to come here again for the Manage NuGet Packages window, and I have to write here that lazy loading. I hope it will return me back what I need, and not really. So for that, entity framework core.lazy loading maybe. No. So I came back here. So these are the entity framework was fine, but not .NET, not .core, but simply .tools, .proxy. So these are the NuGets that we have to use. .core is already installed. So start with the .tools, which will give us this option. And then we also have to select the 5.0.15 version. We install it, accept it. Then we can move for the proxies. We select the right version here as well. Good. And then we have to use the SQL server as well. It's still installing, maybe. Installed Castle. No, it's going to be now. Yes, fine. And the last thing will be to use the SQL server. And also we have to select the proper version for that. And that way, if we install these, it will enable us in the movie context class, in the options builder, to use these properties of it. And we can see here that under packages, everything appeared. It appeared the core itself, the proxies, the SQL server, and the tools as well. So if we come here in the movie context, then we can continue our work with. So options builder, if it's not configured, then the options builder use lazy loading proxies as well, and obey that use SQL server, and in the SQL server we have to add the connection string. So that is why we copied it starting from the beginning, and I have to use an @ symbol at the beginning outside of the string marks, and then I copy it inside. So basically that's it. And then what we can do is to test if everything works correctly with the database. And for that we came back here to the program.cs in the main function, and what we can do is create a movie context db equals new movie context. And then what we can do is db.movies, that is what we can ask here. And for that we will add a new movie with the properties here. And let's see that if we have a title, something with the year of release as this current year, and with the genre of horror movie, we added it. Then we have to save it to the database. So we call the db.savechanges method, and then we will iterate through it. db.movies, db.movies, and we simply write out to the console each item's title in that case. Okay, so we save it, we run it, and we hope for the best. And one thing that we will do in addition is that we will use, you can see here that something is the title, it appears, so everything works correctly, and this is the first step in order to have everything aligned for us. Okay, so what I would like to do here is jump into the movie, and what I would like to do is create a public override for the toString. And for the toString, I like to create an override just because to have everything written out. So for the first, I will have the ID. For the second, I will have the title, I will have the genre, and I will have the year of release. Okay, seems to be okay. Public override string to string. What is the problem? Strange. Okay, I forget the return. It's very important. Okay, so using the toString, I write out every property of that. So basically not writing out, but returning it in a string, in a concatenated string format. So if I run it again, it won't be good, sorry. But I would like to change it to remove the title, writing out only the item. And in that case, everything should appear on the screen for us. So the ID, the name, the title, the genre, and the year. It's very good. Because in that case, I simply can write out the item itself and everything will just fine. Everything will work just fine. Okay, so the next thing will be the XML processing. For that, I have to use this link, which I will open for you. As you can see here, what we have is a movies XML where we can have movie entities starting from here until here. And then inside we have awards as well, but we will skip the awards. So we will focus only on these properties of the movies. Okay, so what we can have here is the next step. So XML processing, create a static class named movie creator, and inside the method named create movies that can create movie objects from the movies.xml file. In the method, create a func delegate which accepts a string type path of the file and returns an enumerable which contains movie objects referenced collections, and save all the movies into the database. So basically, I will create here a class, which is movie creator, public class. For that, I copied here the XML path, static class, so it will be a public static class. And inside we have to create a so-called, where is it? Create movies. A so-called create movies method. So public static void create movies like this, and inside we have to use a func delegate. So it says here that create a func delegate which accepts a string type path of the file. Okay, so we immediately will use a func delegate here, func creator, and in the func I will let it know what properties should have. So basically the first parameter will be a string, the second one will be an enumerable for the movies. Sorry, but for that we only use one as movie. And basically it will have one parameter, so it will be the X, or we can name it as URL. And inside what we would like to do is basically the XML processing itself. So it's very simple. We will use a list to store movies inside. Movies equals new list movies. Sorry, just movie in a single form. And then what we have to do is create an X document doc.xdocument.load. We have to use the XML LINQ for that. And in the load method, we will pass the input parameter, which will be a string type of the URL. And we will move along, but if it's not clear for you, we then have to call this creator func delegate here. And this is when it will receive the string URL. Just like that. So I can delete this here. So inside the method, we are creating a func delegate. in terms of real usage, this is maybe not the best example, but in terms of practice exercise, it's good, because then we can use exercise how to use inbuilt delegates like the func delegate. So I create the func delegate here, and then I will call it here. So instead of creating a func delegate, I simply can write everything which is outside without using the func delegate, and simply return it at the end. But this is a practice exercise, so get over it. So I have to create the movies list, and I have to create the X document in order to load the XML file from this URL. And whenever I'm calling the func delegate, this URL as a string type will be passed to it. Good. The next step will be to have a for each. This for each will go through the descendants, and the descendants will be named as movie. It will have X element. I don't know what is happening. X element item in doc.descendants for the movie. And yes, and when I'm inside, I have to create the movie M, which will be a new movie. For the movie.title, for the ID, I never do anything, because using the ID with a key attribute immediately translates to us that it will be always auto incremented in every insert, so I don't have to care with it anyhow. Then in the title, I have to use that item.element. The element will have a name of title with a capital, and I have to use the value out of it. Okay, so this is a great variable assignment. And then I have to use the genre as well. So item.element genre.value. We have the same. And the last thing is the movie.year of release, which must be parsed. So I have to use int.parse for the element year of release, and I have to use the dot value here. Okay, I move it a little bit away, just like that. So year of release, that value here, and then when I have it, I have to use the movies.add to add this item to it. And when I'm at the end of the func delegate, I have to return the movies. Since the movies is a list, the list can be referenced with an enumerable interface, so it will result us in no problem. And this create movies method basically have to return us the movies list. So for that, instead of returning void, so basically nothing, I will return enumerable movie types. And for that, whenever this func delegate is called and this delegate returning us back enumerable interface reference for movie objects, then I simply call return here as well. So basically this is how we can practice this. Okay, seems to be okay, but one thing I forget to do before saving everything to the database is these few settings here. So the title of the movie, it also says that maximum 18 characters can be accepted, and this field is a required field. So for that, I have to come here, and on top of the title property, I have to apply max length attribute for 80 characters, and it is a required field. So for the required, I have to use a required attribute as well. So basically this is two things which I forgot to do, but now it's okay. Okay, so XML processing, we are ready so far, and the last thing we have to do is to save all the movies to the database. So jump into the program.cs section, and basically very simple, what I would like to do is to remove this. We can have the for each, but not for the db.movies, but for the movie context that not context, sorry, movie creator dot create movies. This create movies will return us back the enumerable movies collection, and we can simply have here, instead of writing these items out, but we can leave it here as is, so it will have a movie type, and we can run it just to be sure that everything is processed properly in the func delegate. Not so good. So I'm writing out nothing. Okay, that can be a problem. And then when we are running it, we can see that the Godfather and everything is written out here. So far, everything has 0 as an ID. It's not a bug. It's natural at the moment, because these items are only coming from the XML, and in the XML there is no ID. So basically every value of the integer will be 0, as you can see here. And after we save everything to the database, then the ID will be incremented by 1 in every step. So we will see it in a moment, but we can see so far that the XML processing is working correctly. So everything which we wrote here is going to be okay. Okay, okay, this is okay. So what we would like to do is to use the db.movies. I said movies, and add, and I would like to add every item to it. And whenever I edit everything, I would like to save everything, and I make it a shorter version like this, and I would like to process everything which is inside the DB. So the db.movies, I would like to check everything, and I will write out every item. So if everything works correctly, and if everything saves to the database, and everything saves correctly, and whenever I'm after these accessing the movies in the database, I should have the ID incremented 1 by 1. So let's run it and see what is happening. Okay, it seems to be okay, because as we can see, the IDs are all incremented 1 by 1. So far we can say that doc it. Okay. So far we can say that everything works as expected. Okay, so the next step is the attribute usage section of the exercise. Create an attribute called minimum year attribute. Create an attribute so it can be applied to properties only. It should be named as add the attribute, so it can be applied to properties only. So for that, we will have to come here, add the new class, and minimum year attribute. For naming conventions, we have to always use the postfix of attribute for every class. It's just like we did it for the exceptions, for the events, and so on and so on. And we have to inherit it from the base attribute class. And inside what we have to do, the attribute should have a public int property where the minimum year can be stored. So what we have here is a public int minimum year property, just like that. Then the exercise also states to create a constructor where this value can be set. So I will have minimum year equals my, just like that. And one additional thing, that this minimum year attribute which we are created just now should be applied only to properties. So for that I have to use the attribute usage attribute targets.property. So this is how I can set it. Just for a simple thing, I like to name it as is, so everything works fine. Small things, but important things. Okay, so far it seems to be okay. One last step is place the attribute on the year of release property of the movie class with 1993 as an input. Okay, so I jump here. I can copy it from here, a movie, minimum year of, yes, and I add it here. Yes, and one value, because constructor expects one parameter as well, so I have to use 1997. One thing, if you can see here that the attribute part seems a little bit pale in terms of colors, which means that the attribute as written out is not important here, but in terms of creating the entity class or creating the class for it, we have to, no, we don't have to use it, but we should use it because of the naming conventions. But you can see here that the IDE is intelligent enough to see that this is something that it can be avoided in terms of writing out. So only minimum year can be written out just like that. Okay, so attribute usage seems to be okay so far, but we can see if everything works correctly in the next section, which is the validation using reflection part of the exercise. Okay, so for the validation, in the validation, basically what we have to create is a validator class that can validate a certain property if it has minimum year attribute on it or applied to it. It should contain a method called isValid for the T generic type and accepting a string property name, where T is the class whose property you want to check and property name is the name of the property. So I come here, add the new class, name it validator, and in the validator I will use it as public. Maybe it could be static, we will see. For the moment it's okay like that. And it should have an isValid method. I think we can have it as a static, public static class validator and public static void isValid for the T type, string property name, and T will be the object. You can't write out object because that is a type, so usually when you are referring to an object as a parameter, you simply write out obj for short, and then we have to use the validation logic. So basically what we would like to do is to get the type of the T parameter, which can be any type of parameter. So if you want to be, if you want to create a generic purpose method, then basically you can remove the T from here and you can write here that the second object should be an object type. This is technically okay, but a better approach is to use and mark always as generic like here, and then you can use for that type directly. So what I would like to do here is to firstly get the type. For the type, we can use two options. We can use the object reference and we can use the get type of it, just like that. Or we can use the type of, we can use the type of for the T. Both of them, what is happening? Both of them is doing the same, but there are many cases when you do not have the reference for the type itself. You only have the reference for the object, so basically for the object itself. And for that reason we can decide which we would like to use. In this exercise I will use this, and the next one, the ADT demo exam 2, I will use the get type. But basically both of them the same. The better approach is the .get type, I think. So type of T for get type, no, not get type, but get properties. And the properties return us everything. Another approach is to get all the properties, iterate through them, and find what you would like to have. And this can be done in two ways. One way is to look for the property name as a string, for example, or the other option is to check all the properties and check all the properties if they have your requested attribute on it. But another option, which we will use here, is the get property by the property name. So this is technically possible. This will return us back a property info, just like that. For the property info, we have to use reflection. And the next thing is working with the minimum year attribute, MYA for short. And what I will do here is the property that get custom attribute with a type of minimum year attribute, comma false, just like that. And this won't be okay, because then we still have to use a casting, which can be done two ways. This is the old way when you place it here, or the second way when you, instead of doing like this, you do like this as minimum year attribute. Both of them is technically correct, but something is not good, because get custom attributes for the minimum year attribute, comma false, will return us back multiple elements. So we have to use, for example, something like single or default, and then we can cast it with the as operator to a minimum year attribute. Both of them is correct. Okay, if it's okay, then we have to use the property value. The property's value can be accessed from the property directly. And for that, we can use an int parsing for the prop.getValue for the object. And then what we would like to do is following the exercise here. It states that this method should return a Boolean value, which should be true if the minimum year is stored on in the attribute is smaller than the property's value, and it should return false otherwise. And then we have an additional statement when we have to throw an argument exception if something is not validated, or the attribute doesn't have the value which is needed. So for the if, we have to check if the attribute, which is the MYA, minimum year attribute, is not null, and if the property value, which is already gained here, is bigger or equals to the attribute minimum year value, property value bigger equals yes. And if it's true, then we have to return true. Otherwise, we have to use an else if statement and check if the attribute, which is the MYA, is not equal to null, and if the property value is smaller like the MYA minimum year attribute. In that case, we have to return false. I make it a shorter format. Now it underlines for me the return because we already working as void, so I have to rename it for bool. And there is one else case: if not this or not that is true, then we simply have to throw new argument exception. Okay, it seems to be okay for me. So if the minimum year attribute is not null, which is correct in both cases, then we are checking for the property value. If it's bigger or equals to the minimum year, then it's okay. If it's smaller, then it's not okay. And if something is wrong is happening here, then we are throwing a new argument exception. Okay, it seems to be okay. Technically, this question mark can be left out of here because it's basically checking if MYA is not null. but since we are checking here as well, it can be left out. Yes, or we can simply write here the question marks and get rid of this part, but I prefer to write it out this way because then I immediately can see that I'm checking for null as well. Okay, so the isValid method seems to be okay. The next thing, how we can check if it's working correctly or not. For that, we have to go back to the program section, and we have to write a small logic, which is basically checking me that every movie is valid or not. So in the movies, I can write out console.writeLine item, and after the item, I can write out after some marks, for example, that the validator that isValid method is used. I hope it can work out like this. So the isValid method, I write it here that I would like to test on movie objects, because the validator can be applied to any kind of object since it's generic for T-type. The only requirement whenever the isValid method is running is that the property name should be casted for minimum year attribute. So if it's having minimum year attribute on it, it's okay. Otherwise, it won't be okay. So for the movie, I have to give it here year of release, just like that, and the other one will be the movie, which is the item here at the moment. Okay, so let's run it, and basically what I would like to see here is that every line of the movie, which is fetched now from the database, is written out, which is correct, and after the hash marks, I would like to see everything is validated with the validator. So basically everything is checking if the attribute placed on the object with the current value of 1993 is validated, so it's bigger or smaller. As you can see here, 94, 08, 93, 94, all of them is true, and this one as the last one, all of them is true because all of them is bigger than 1993 or equal to it, and everything else, so 1960 and 1972, are false because they are smaller than the value given by the attribute. So I just closed it. So given this minimum year attribute, everything is smaller than this. We can check it that, for example, what was the smallest? Maybe it was 70. 1960, I think it was something like that. So we can check it if changing the attribute's value changes the output of it. We can see here that 1960 is still true. Okay, 1960 is still true, and everything else is bigger than, so we can check it from 1970. Hopefully 1960 is the only one which is false. Okay, so technically it's going to be okay, but I will change it back to 1993, just like the exercise asked for it. Okay, so the validation using reflection is correct at this moment, and we can go through for the unit testing section. But before we go there, so basically the validation is a tricky part because a lot of you is not really understanding what is the concept. So the concept of a validator or a validation factory is basically to create a framework-like manner or framework-like environment when you using attributes in your entity class can create some kind of verification or some kind of validation. So I can understand that one point can be here is simply checking that if the movie that year of release is bigger than 1993 or smaller than. But the fact is that this is a low-level approach of the problem. A higher-level approach is to create validation factories and validator classes and validator methods, which are fetching the type of the object for what the method is called, and then checking using reflection what properties does this object have, and if the object has some kind of properties, it shouldn't be only one property, there could be many properties. So for example, entity framework core is doing the same whenever movie context, where is movie? Entity framework core is doing the same. It's checking if the public class movie has any attribute applied to it. Since it has, because it has a table property applied to it, it is using reflection to check what type of or what kind of attributes are applied, and based on those attributes it can check additional information, like how on earth is it should rename the movie entities table, or how is it possible that or not how is it possible, but what is the key attribute inside this full entity. Then it can see that when it has a key attribute placed on it, and you can see here that multiple attributes can be placed on top of one property or on method. So basically this title method, whenever it's processed by the entity framework core, when it's creating the database and data tables for it, it can check that this property has a required attribute and it has a max length attribute. So both of them should be treated accordingly. So basically, where is it? Validator. So basically, validation is a higher level concept when you would like to create a system which is open for extension. So whenever we have a isValid method like here, but it can be made a bit more flexible with additional lines of code. But whenever you are creating something like this, which can be basically treated as a universal validation, then you simply have to create entity classes and apply those attributes like this, and the validation can process everything under the hood based on your logic which you have created here. So again, in one sentence, creating validation using reflection is a higher level of concept compared to checking the properties value, which is a lower level concept. And these kind of validation, this is the second sentence, can be found in frameworks and in bigger libraries which are doing this kind of approach in order to check and verify and validate given properties or methods or something else like fields. Fields can be used this as well. Okay, so validation seems to be okay, and now we are going for the unit testing of these items. And in the unit testing we have to create a separate project. So right click on the solution, not on the project, in the solution, and add a new project, which is not visible for you unfortunately, but there is it. And we will use not a console application but a class library for the C# projects, and it says that name it create a separate which per unit test and validation, create a class. So it doesn't name anything, so we can use it as tests .NET 5.0 as the current, and it will say that create a class for the validator class. Sorry. Okay, whenever it's not writing anything, we can name it as we would like to do validator test, for example. And for that we have to use test fixture attribute, and we can write here, we can use here the install package NUnit, but I would like to prefer again to come here for the tests and manage NuGet packages, and we will write here NUnit3 in the browse section, NUnit3, because we will need the NUnit itself, accept. Then we will need the NUnit3 test adapter as well. It's very important. And we will need testing SDK, something like this. Microsoft Net Test SDK. So this is something which we will need in addition as well. If these three are not installed, then we won't be able to run the tests. Accept. And in the dependencies, in the packages, we can see that all three is here. In the validator test, we can rename this class in the Solution Explorer as well. And in the text fixture, we can now use the NUnit framework as well. And in the view, we can find the test explorer, which is here. Yes, and we have to drag and drop it like this. Okay, so we have the text explorer here, and if everything works correctly, it can identify us the tests, maybe not yet. So in order, we have to use a public void x66. Let's see. Okay, now it's working because it's identifying the tests. So basically, again, when we talked about the validation in the validator, I mentioned you that this is something when most frameworks use, so it's a higher concept. It's important because both Entity Framework Core is using the same principle in terms of attributes and their checking. And of course, where is it? NUnit or any other test frameworks use the same approach, because you can see here that how NUnit finds the tests for us. Basically, it is checking that which classes have the test fixture attribute applied on them, and sorry, and inside that class, it is checking for the test attribute for which methods have these test attributes. And based on that, it can load the tests inside this smaller window. Okay, so I copied here which are the three packages which should be installed for the test project itself. And then let's see what is the exercise. So create a class for validator class that tests the operation of the isValid method in three ways. Create a test for the minimum attribute and has a valid value, for another test for the invalid value, and check for the exceptions. So basically we have to create three kind of tests. One will be the valid value test, and for the valid value test we basically have to check int year of release, and this int year of release will be passed as a test case, and for that test case we will use 1993 and 3 or 4 additional. So 1993 will be okay because it is equal, and everything which is higher will be fine. So 4, 5 and something even higher will be or should be fine. Okay, and in the test, what we would like to create is create a movie m equals new movie. For the movie, we have to add reference to the movie's live, so that way it can identify us the movie entity as well. For the movie year of release, I add the parameter from the input of the method, and we will assert that the validator that is valid method for a movie type. And movie type, yes, we can write it here like that, and I will break it here. So the validator is valid for movie type, receives two parameters. The one will be the year of release as well, and the other parameter will be the object itself, which is the M. And we would like to assert that this something which will be validated, which basically result in a true or a false result, is equal to, so we will write here equal to true, and we delete this. Okay, so whatever is this validator is valid method returning back us for the year of release property for the M object should be equal to true, because everything which we placed here as test cases should return us back a true in terms of validation. So everything should be valid year of release. This is one option to write it directly like this as a string, but this is not a best approach because it can have a few problems. Okay, let's run firstly the tests, and then you can see in the small window that every test case is basically created here as smaller tests. So it's good to see that every test case is a separate test listed like here. And then do the other approach for the invalid value testing, and you can see here that this movie is also in a little bit paler color, so basically we can get rid of this part of the code, but I will leave it as is. I copy everything from here down below. It will be the invalid value test, and everything can be invalid if it's smaller. 1940, which is smaller, so everything should return us back, false. And the other approach is not using as string, but using the name of, and we can write here that m.year of release, because the name of will return us back the m.year of release's name as a string, I guess. Name of, let me hover. Unfortunately it doesn't show me, but basically it will do the same. So it's a better approach, because whenever I change something in the movie class, so for example, if I change it from year of release to year of release underscore, I immediately have here a problem that, this is not working correctly. I don't have this kind of property. While in the string version, this is just a simple string. I don't have any feedback if it's valid or not. So this version, the name of version, is a much better approach, because you get live feedback, because it's a property, not just a simple string. Okay, so year of release, pass the property, checking for valid, it should return us false. So let's see. Let's run these, and we will hope that everything will be the best. It seems to be okay. Okay, and then we can have a test as well for the missing attribute test, which will be public void missing attribute test. For the missing attribute test, we won't use any test cases. We will create a movie m equals new movie. M.year of release should be something. But basically we don't have to write anything for that. And we would like to check if the attr.throws is true or false. So basically we have to use attr.throws. And there are multiple options for that. We can have here the argument exception like that. And we can write here that validator that is valid for the name of, for the M object is true or false. Yes, and this is how it works. Name of, and again for the name of, we can check for the m.id. Because we would like to check if the attribute is applied to the property or not. And let me check it, what will be the result of this test. Throws arguments, yes, so basically we are checking if the attribute is missing, because if it's missing, we can see in the validator that if it's missing, it will throw a new argument exception, and it means that this thing, checking for throws argument exception, will be true. So we can see here that this is fine. If I check for something else, out of memory exception, we can see that it will throw another type of exception, so it won't be okay. And you can see here that expected out of range exception, but it was argument exception. Argument exception. Okay, and if we check it for something else, so for example, in the movie, we have the genre. If we are checking for the genre, we will have a problem there, some kind of exception. And the exception will have, or will come from a place. You can see here that object reference not set to an instance of the object. And if you look closer in a debug mode, you can see that the problem will be about the genre, and especially when we would like to cast the properties value. So this section will be the problem because it cannot be casted to an integer. And this is the problem. So that way we can change it back to ID, which basically never used, only in the database. But in terms of testing, this should work out. This is one way, and another way is to create a public class, demo class, and just public int some prop. Just for the testing, we can create this demo class, and we can use the same assert method for that. DC for some property DC. And in that case, we clearly can see that this class has nothing to do with anything, but since we are created the validator in a generic manner, or not, yes, it's created in a generic manner, it can be created to be more generic and more flexible, but so far so good for us like this. And public int some property does not have anything applied to it, so we can check again this method, this testing method, and it's okay for both the movie object and its ID, and it's okay for both of the demo class which we have just created here. Okay, so the testing is basically that's it. So we tested for the valid value, for the invalid value. We saw a different approach in terms of the name of, and we checked for some kind of exceptions. Okay, so the last example will be the LINQ data querying. Since it doesn't require any extra classes, we can simply write them in the program.cs main section. So what we will use here is some kind of small separator, and we will use the LINQ queries here. So the first thing is count how many movies are in each genre and display it as a genre number format. So for that we can use var q1 equals to from x in db.movies, and basically whenever we see something like this exercise, we immediately know that we have to use some kind of grouping functionality. So we will do like that. We will say that group X by X dot genre. X dot, what is the problem? The problem is that something is not yet included. Select X. Let's see. db.movies has some problem. Could not find. Yes, it should offer us to use LINQ, but somehow it's not offering me. So I've come here using system.LINQ, and this should solve us the problem. As you can see here, the error disappeared. This is some bug, I guess, in the latest Visual Studio 2022. So basically we have to use grouping group X by X.genre into G, and instead of selecting X, I have to select a new anonym class, and it says that genre number format, so I have to use it genre colon, and it should be not colon, sorry, it should be g.key, because this is the key which we are grouping by, and then I have to use the number which is the g dot count, g.count. Yes, and for checking, it's not requested in the exercise to write everything out, but you can create some kind of extension method. So you can write out everything like q1.write using extension method. And for us so far, it's enough if we have a breakpoint here and check what is inside. So if we run it, we can write check here that in the Q1, in the results view, we can have the action, drama, and thriller categories or genres, and we can have a look how many entities are in each category. So it seemed to be okay for us. Okay, the second one, display the movies that were released before 1994 in descending order of their title's length. So for that, we can use Q2, and then we, from X in db.movies, we would like to select everything where the X.year of release is smaller than 1994, and order them by their X.title.length in a descending version. Select X, just like that. Okay, we can run it as well. Since the breakpoint has moved, we are now at Q2. Results view, and we can see here that since we are selecting all the X's in their original format, we can see here that the IDs are listed, the titles are listed, the genres are listed, and the year of releases are listed as well, but we can see that everything is smaller than 1994 in terms of year of release, and the titles seems to be in a descending order, so that is good as well. Okay, and let's see what is the last one. For each movie genre, find the movie that has the longest title, then place it into an anonymous class that contains genre, title, and year of release properties. Okay, so for the Q3, we would like to from X in db.movies, and this one will be a tricky one, so let's see. We would like to again group everything by X.genre into G. This is very similar until so far. And then what I would like to do is determine what is the longest title. For that, we can use the let here, longest title length. and we can calculate it by using the following method. We can use the grouping. So for the G, I have to call the max function, which will have the following m.title.length. So if this is a simple LINQ that selecting the max element based on the title's length. So it's very easy until this point. And then I will close the test explorer so we have a better view. So the longest title length goes like this, is going like this. And then I would like to select a new anonymous class, and in the anonymous class I would like to use the genre as the g.key. I would like to use the title, but the title will be tricky because I would like to select the first one in every category. And by first I mean that the first one which corresponds to the requirements. So basically, find the movie that has the longest title, and the longest title is defined by this let longest title length. So I have to check that how my title is compared to the longest title length. So for that we can use the g.first. This would be the key element, and the g.first I have to write here that y.title.length equals the longest title length dot title. So it means that after I grouped everything into dedicated groups by the genre, I define this longest title length variable, which is basically selecting from all of the categories the longest title by the length, and then I'm comparing this longest title, which is at this moment an integer, to every title inside. So basically this is the comparing section, and this returns me back, or specifically the first method returns me back a full object, and from that full object I would like to receive the title itself, just like that. And then I would like to do the year of release, and for that I use the same approach. e.title.length equals longest title dot year of release. So basically this is how I can compare it or check it or validate it based on this pre-calculated value. Okay, so let's run it and we will see that this won't be okay. And the problem is not so simple, but on the other hand it's very simple. And we can see that okay, so the breakpoint stopped it, but basically when we would run it to run more, we can see here that some exception would arrive to the console. So you can see here that something is not okay, because in the results view we cannot see anything. And the problem is maybe in the message, I think. So if you can take a look here, it's write out something, and this may indicate either a bug or a limitation of in entity framework. So the problem here is the following, that we would like to create so complex things like checking the title's length and compare it to something else. So basically the problem here is that entity framework core is not able to translate the LINQ statement into SQL query. And the problem is coming from this. So basically the entity framework core has its own limitations. The LINQ is working correctly because we can see here that nothing is underlined by red. So the solution for this, which is not a great solution, is to call that toList method for the movies, just like this. I run it again. We see what is inside the Q3, and we can discuss afterwards. So you can see here that in Q3 we can see that the genre drama has the longest title, The Shawshank Redemption, with the year of release 1994. For the action, the longest title is The Dark Knight, released in 2008, and for the genre thriller, The Psycho, released in 1960, has the longest title. So basically we can see that our LINQ query worked correctly, except the fact that it wanted to be run on Entity Framework core itself. So the problem is that the Entity Framework has its limitations, and if you would like to create so complex thing which is not yet supported or not yet written in the framework itself, you get some kind of exception like we see there. For the solution, I'm a bit avoided saying solution, because this is some kind of trickery, because whenever you are calling toList, toArray, or to something else, whatever is happening is basically you create your objects, so the db.movies, you create your objects inside the memory. And if you have a data table which has, for example, 20 gigabytes of entities inside, whenever you call toList, it would like to try to place 20 gigabytes of data in your memory, which is probably not going to fit there. So using toList in small project like this seems to be okay, but I would like to highlight that this is not a solution. This is just a workaround which can be suitable for many projects, but not all the projects. So it's very important to know this and highlight this. But you can see here that basically the query is working correctly in this exercise. Okay, and that was the end of the LINQ part or LINQ section as well. So we basically finished our demo exercise 1. We created the database at the beginning, we created the entity class, and we created the DB context class as well. Then we added attributes to it, like the table attribute, key attribute, max length required attribute, and so on. Then we fetched the XML document and we processed it and returned it back. In this small exercise, we created a func prebuild delegate for this purpose. Then we created our own attribute and use it. And then based on this attribute, we created a validator method using reflection. We created unit tests for this validator class basically. And then we queried a few data using the LINQ query, LINQ's query syntax to be more precise, and the LINQ in this case was working on the db.movies, so it was working on the database itself, except the last one, because then we used toList to handle the problem. But for example, if we change this from the movie creator that create movies, it should work like fine as well. So let's run it and we can see it. I place a breakpoint here as well. And see that in the results view everything is working like the same. So this is one key point of the LINQ queries, that it doesn't care what is the data structure beneath it. It can be a database, it can be a list, or something else, of course, and basically everything will work just fine. So this was guys, this was the first part of the exercise. I hope you find it useful. So I'm ending this video, and if you would like to check what is the more complex exercise, you can head over to the demo exercise 2 as well, and you can check it as well. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. Bye bye guys, have a good practice.